Happy Chime Noises is a fellow League YouTuber who specializes in off-meta strategies that, despite how counterintuitive they may be, manage to find high elo success. This can range either from champions in off-the-cuff roles such as Aphelios Jungle, or champions of divergent builds like EP Skarner or Crit Volibear. For years, his channel has been serving as a reminder that while there may be an overarching meta, one where there's a prevailing way to play a champion and the game, it is possible, however unlikely, for some outlandish idea to overcome its impractical flaws and be just as successful as your standard approach to League. On occasion, one of those strategies works so well that, ironically, it becomes actual meta, one such instance being when Janna Top became prevalent in pro play a couple years back. Historically, there have been builds and playstyles that have risen to prominence. Some have been allowed to continue existing, while others were quickly nerfed or outright deleted from the game. The question is, why are some of them okay while others aren't? Additionally, why do they mostly have a tendency to be removed, not maintained? Today we'll be going over gimmick builds in League of Legends and if they should be allowed to exist or not. Now, for those of you out there who enjoy watching players cook up some crazy off-meta strategies, here's something else you can cook up, only it takes a lot less effort. HelloFresh is back to sponsor my channel once again. HelloFresh is a catering service that delivers meal kits to your door, pre-prepped, pre-portioned, and pre-packaged, all for your convenience. Wow, that was a lot of P's. If you're thinking about losing weight this year, just like you attempted last year and the year before and the year before, HelloFresh is the one way you can do so without settling for bland food. They have over 30 plus calorie and protein smart recipes with a total of over 45 dinner options and more market items that suit any dietary habits or lifestyles, keto, vegetarian, vegan, what have you. This time around, they're actually taking care of the most important meal of the day, breakfast. So long as you have a subscription to HelloFresh, you'll get a free breakfast item per box. Looking through their website, you can browse each menu from week to week and choose what you're interested in. Each dish comes with a list of ingredients as well as an estimated time frame for how long they take to make. If you're looking to spice up 2024 with some new meals without having to go out of your way to cook, definitely recommend you try out HelloFresh. Check the QR code on screen and use my code VARSFREE and you'll get a free breakfast item per box while your subscription is active, so be sure to try it out. Thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring the video, but for now, let's get back to cooking some gimmick builds. Some of you might be wondering if this video is just repeating the off-metaverse troll pick one I made last year. To clarify, that video elaborates on what differentiates an actual viable off-meta pick or strategy versus one that just flat out doesn't work. This video will talk about off-meta picks that have worked and why there is so much outrage about them. Looking at the thumbnail, longtime players may recall some of these in vivid detail. A common accusation Happy Chime Noises gets for his content is that he influences players to try these builds for themselves, usually resulting in games that go to complete with the curious player often feeding their ass off and losing the game. And while that's a pretty baseless criticism to make, it does bring to light a possible dilemma. Competitive games, more than other types, have a natural tendency to formulate the most optimal way of achieving victory, be it the character you play, the equipment you buy, or the playstyle you opt for, with the belief that following these methods will net you ideal results. Any strategy that goes against the meta is intrinsically seen as negative, compounded especially in League, where the consequences of one's actions affect not just them, but 4 other players. League's player base is so averse to off-meta picks like Janna Top or Darius ADC because it contradicts their preconceptions on the champion or the role they're playing, which is perfectly understandable. Looking at a champion such as Gnar, while his W and ultimate have ridiculous AP scaling, it makes little sense to build ability power on him. This gets reinforced by seeing the vast majority of Gnar players going for physical damage items. So when you run into a Gnar player who goes Nashor's first, it goes against everything you know about the champion, and when players encounter something whose practicality is unknown, typically they assume it's not effective because if it were, more people would be going in. That is both the strength and weakness of an off-meta strategy. Your team may not know how viable a gimmick build is, if it's even viable at all, but it stands to reason that the enemy team may be just as unaware, something you can use to your advantage. When looking at a champion such as Kai'Sa, based on prior experiences and understanding, you're expecting her to be a short-range, high DPS rushdown marksman, and so, people will subconsciously develop a game plan around that form of pressure, making it all the more disorienting when they start getting pelted by long-range artillery fire out of nowhere. Kai'Sa has a rather infamous reputation for her sheer build diversity, seemingly making efficient use of almost any item in the game due to how she plays. This has led to several build paths for her, ranging from standard crit to on-hit effects to assassination via lethality items, and of course to AP builds. Sometime around mid-season 11, Kai'Sa players would instead go full AP and max Void Seeker, utilizing its immense base damage, plasma stacking, long range, and cooldown reset to snipe enemies without even being in sight range of her target. This was immediately followed by AP Zeri, another high-mobility short-range DPS marksman. Ultra Shock Laser had a similar idea to it, where she could repeatedly shoot a wall to expand her W's attack radius, continuously damaging opponents from a far distance, much to their dismay. Since then, both builds have been sufficiently gutted to where you can't go the entire game just doing that for maximum efficiency. It's here where we arrive at the first point of contention with gimmick builds. Like I mentioned earlier, when you go a different build on a champion or play them in a different role, since that contradicts one's perception on the champion, the reactive response is usually negative until proven otherwise. When Zeri and Kai'Sa first went these builds, people had the same attitude, believing they were troll picks. It wasn't until said builds displayed adequate, if not outperforming results, that it started to become more accepted and then eventually became the dominant strategy, thus becoming meta. Consequently, they were met with a lot of controversy. Players from across the world began complaining about how unpleasant it was to fight against Kai'Sa and Zeri, feeling like they were playing a bullet hell game, not a MOBA. After a sizable amount of backlash, the balance team went on to nerf both strategies into inviolability, and while occasionally you still see the likes of Kai'Sa running AP, any semblance of her going the long-range poke marksman has been eradicated. The question is, why? It's clear that this strategy was indeed effective, so why was it taken out? Now, since I don't work there, I can't speak for Riot's balance philosophy, but over the past decade I've been part of this game for, I have somewhat of an understanding of their thought process. The notion of off-meta skirts an extremely fine line between two factors. Not only does it have to be practical enough to garner a net positive result, but it has to be intuitive enough for players to figure it out quickly. AP Kai'Sa and Zeri spamming W all game was certainly a viable course of action. It may have even been more effective than going traditional, but the strategy warps the perceived image players have of the champion. Like I said, Kai'Sa and Zeri are known for their incredible DPS and uptime, consistently outputting huge pressure throughout a fight so long as they're not being focused down, but that can be easier said than done given their comparatively shorter range as opposed to backline marksmen like Jinx, Caitlyn, and Ezreal. Riot wants everyone to see those two like that as well. They're not meant to sit far away and spam W all game slowly poking you down like a Xerath or Ziggs. It would be like seeing a cheetah run at the speed of a snail. So while pragmatically the strategy has merit, it's also counterintuitive. For a gimmick build to be considered safe, quote-unquote, to keep in the game, it has to make both practical and intuitive sense. It can't just be one or the other. Another noteworthy example of a gimmick build that was actually good but went against the champion's playstyle would have to be Tank Echo from way back in Season 6. Tank Echo was one of the most notorious instances of off-meta strategies that became meta. Echo was marketed to players as an assassin with a playstyle not unlike Fizz, very focused on hit and run, going in fast and getting out fast. The issue is that unlike other assassins, Echo's kit was engineered in such a way that allowed him to thrive exceptionally well as a sustained fighter. Timewinder served as a neutral tool which he could use to poke enemies without engaging. Being AoE, it could wave clear very efficiently, and the slow attached to it made it useful for either chasing or running away from enemies. Parallel Convergence granted him a long-lasting stun plus a massive shield, an ability that would make much more sense to have on someone with persistent DPS given how long it takes to activate. And with the missing health damage added to his basic attacks, it provided him with deceptively good DPS. As a cherry on top, C-Drive Resonance used to also slow enemies on top of speeding him up, making it virtually impossible to run away from him if he was on top of you. Echo took advantage of the massive shield from his W, the massive heal from his ultimate, and the amazing stick potential he had through his passive and Q, which allowed him to get multiple procs of Iceborne Gauntlet while dealing a ton of damage over time through Sunfire. However, that's not what he was intended for. He was intended to be an assassin, or at the very least a skirmisher, so the idea of Echo being super tanky and playing the wet noodle fight versus you was extremely counterintuitive. Players complained about Tank Echo because it didn't agree with the way he was originally designed. The same applies to builds like Full AD Sion or on-hit Nico. I went over Inting Sion plenty of times in the past, but to reiterate, when you look at Sion, you picture a hulking, bulking juggernaut who can soak up a lot of damage and crowd control everyone. Your first instinct isn't to be ready for Sion to 3-shot you and ironically be more threatening when he's dead than alive. Nico's a burst mage assassin. She sneaks up to you, roots you, tosses her Q, and then dumps her gigantic ultimate on you for one big burst. You don't expect her to play like an AD carry, auto-attacking all over the place. Though the funny thing about that is, I feel like thematically, Nico makes a lot more sense playing on hit and being hard to catch, as opposed to her expected role of a teamfight wombo combo attacker, considering she's a chameleon, and chameleons aren't exactly the most confrontational creatures out there. So, having covered examples of gimmick builds that don't work, let's talk about gimmick builds that do, and what's different about them that allows them to stay in the game. First one will be Cho'Gath. Cho'Gath has two builds, tank and AP, which usually comes down to whether you're playing him top or mid. Both builds are equally viable on him. The relatively low cooldowns on his abilities incentivize him staying alive to go through as many rotations of them as possible, while still giving him some pretty serious damage through the scaling on Vorpal spikes. He can also take advantage of the permanent bonus health on Feast to make more efficient use of health scaling runes in items like Sunfire, Heartsteel, Demolish, and Overgrowth. Alternatively, he can also run full AP since all of his abilities have AP ratios, Rupture in particular having 100%. What gives Cho'Gath the privilege of having both options is that regardless of which one he builds, he plays exactly the same way and has exactly the same expectation. Whether he's tank or AP, everyone's afraid of him chain CCing you and munching on your face. You might get thrown off by his Q doing 900 damage to you instead of 3, but the rule of thumb is to avoid getting hit by his Q at all, as that begins the entire combo. Moreover, he'll naturally be very bulky and very big, even if he goes AP, so you still have to treat him like a raid boss juggernaut that requires a BP fighter or tank shredder to dispose of him. it still falls within the confines of being intuitive to play against. Since we talked about AP builds on marksman that got axed off the game, let's talk about an AP build on a marksman that was allowed to stay, AP Twitch. Now listen, I think we can all agree the champion itself is a complete but personal bias aside, Twitch's expected playstyle is to sneak around undetected, then appear out of nowhere and blast anything that moves, kinda like an assassin AD carry. AP Twitch plays exactly the same way. He sneaks around, pops up out of nowhere, then all of a sudden you're dead. AP Twitch and AD Twitch are almost identical when it comes to how they like to kill you and how you're expected to play against him. The only difference is what ends up killing you. For AD Twitch, it's a combination of his basic attack damage and contamination, whereas for AP Twitch, it's a combination of deadly venom and contamination. Either way, you treat him exactly the same. Building AP does make Venom cast more consequential on account of it increasing the potency of the slow and the damage of the stacks that racks up on you, but for the most part, the game plan versus Twitch is exactly the same whether he goes one or the other. He doesn't gain an entirely new playstyle the way Zeri and Kai'Sa did, still a very high risk, high reward marksman. I'm aware that it can be kinda confusing to justify nerfing gimmick builds on the basis of having only one playstyle when there are champions who were literally designed to have multiple. Kha'Zix having access to long-range poke with spike racks, Transformers like Elise, Jace, and Nidalee having a melee and range form, or Cassante. Those champions were intentionally designed to have access to shifting playstyles, for better or worse. It may sound contradictory for me to say that Riot took away AP Kai'Sa because they didn't want her to be a poke mage, whereas Kha'Zix has the same thing with W, but Evolved W never reached a point where it completely altered its gameplay to be just that. For AP Kai'Sa, it did. She literally went an entire game just spamming W. Kha'Zix could spam W, but he still has to go in and kill you the old-fashioned way. And even then, they nerfed his W last year for the very same reason of it being too good and almost replacing his playstyle. Regardless, it all has to do with the items they build, as that tends to govern what they do. I always stood by the notion that items are meant to enhance one's playstyle and not change it, and I think Riot shares that same philosophy. The reason they took away Prowler's Claw and Stridebreaker's dashes while keeping Hextech Rocket Belt and Everfrost was because the former two were so game-altering that they effectively took away the biggest weaknesses of those who built them. Rocket Belt also introduces a dash which may be abusable by mages without one, but mages generally don't care about dashes, and AP assassins can gap close on you pretty easily anyway. As for Everfrost, though the idea of giving hard CC to any champion sounds absurd, most of the champs who built it used it primarily as setup for their, setup. Ara using Everfrost to reduce so she can land her charm, Silas for his chains, Cho'Gath for his Q, etc. Although I suppose diminishing the challenge of landing a critical ability can be equated to Stridebreaker and Prowlers, but I mean they did away with the entire mythic item system altogether anyway. Another big one was when Enchanter supports went top and took advantage of spell thieves to accumulate gold instead of actually CSing, which they responded to by adding the condition that you had to be near an allied champion to accumulate it. Bottom line, in my opinion, a champion should only be allowed a gimmick build if it stays within the confines of their expected playstyle. If a champion's an assassin, they should play like an assassin. If a champion's a slow, immobile juggernaut, they should play like one. If the champion's a marksman, they should play like a marksman. The exception to this is if they were conceptualized and more importantly balanced around having two different roles. Case in point, Vars. He can either be played as a long-range poke champion or a rapid-fire auto-attacker. The thing is, half his kit was geared towards one and half was geared towards the other, splitting his power budget in two. Either way, both playstyles are subject to the same weaknesses of being a backline AD carry. When Vars went top lane and built Radiant Virtue, that was a problem though, since it made him a duelist and not a marksman. It's a case-by-case basis, I think. Players are fine with Kog'Maw having an AP artillery mage build and a machine gun build, but they're extremely unhappy about Blue Kayn building like Red Kayn and vice versa. Obviously, the more popular a champion is, the more likely their gimmick builds are hated. Tank Echo, AP Zeri, and AP Kai'Sa had double-digit pick rates, hence why they had to be addressed. Meanwhile, not many people complain about Emax AP Nasus because no one plays Nasus, at least in high elo. But what do you guys think? Do you believe that gimmick builds, no matter what they are, should be allowed in the game, or do you think all champions should have a set build and playstyle and anything that diverges from it should be taken out? Feel free to share in the comments. That's gonna be it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsFarum, join my Discord server, and check out my other off-meta videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.